We're going to go ahead and finish off with several items in this video, starting off with muscle metabolism, then talking about the difference between twitches and summation and why muscles move the way they do. Finally, finishing off with the difference between including some topics about the cardiac muscle as well as a little bit more about the smooth muscle. There we go. So muscles have three different ways that they can interact. They maintain their metabolic processes. It's creatine phosphate, anaerobic glycolysis, as well as cellular respiration. I'm assuming all of you have had some type of biology course in high school of some sort that taught you about, hey, glycolysis does this, and mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. They produce so much energy when oxygen is present. So we're not going to go into huge detail about that right now. We're just going to go ahead and dive into creatine phosphate as well as that anaerobic exercise that we are going to talk about here in a little while. Creatine phosphate, I'm saying this right, creatine phosphate, there we go. Creatine phosphate and creatine are just sort of a way to help store phosphate in its active form. You have a surplus of ATP in your muscles and you're not really exercising? Well, let's store up that phosphate, make it nice and easy so when we need it for later, we can store it, we can just mobilize it, make it super easy, super quick. Brilliant, smart, wonderful, clever idea. Well, you got about 15 seconds of it. So you can't really rely on it too much. Well, you got another process that you can use. You can use anaerobic glycolysis. That's another fancy way of saying lactic acid cycle or the lactic acid formation. If you don't have oxygen but you need energy, well, you can do this. You can do glucose. You can make glucose and break it apart from glycogen and break it apart and make it into a pyruvic acid, which gives you 2 ATP, and then a little bit more ATP when you form it down into lactic acid, but it's really not much. If you used all your sugar this way, it'd really just give you about 2 minutes. Aerobic respiration or cellular respiration is the way to go. One glucose molecule in comparison to the anaerobic exercise, which only gives you 4, actually gives you 30 to 32 ATP, and it also produces your heat. So big star here, this is what your heart uses. It has to absolutely use the cellular respiration. It has to use aerobic respiration. We're going to go ahead and skip that. Now, we have talked everything, and we talked metabolism, we talked about the necessity of calcium, we talked about where lactic acid builds up. Kind of makes sense, by the way, that lactic acid would build up in your muscles if you're really intensely training and you get that burn because, well, oxygen can't quite make it to your muscles as quickly as it needs. So, well, if you want muscles to move, you gotta get energy from somewhere, so it makes lactic acid out of glucose to get its energy. If you get too much of a buildup of lactic acid and ADP, you're going to get muscle fatigue. If you've eaten up all your reserves of CP, creatine phosphate, and oxygen, and all the nutrients such as sugars, and maybe if you started converting proteins and fats, then, well, that's not going to be good. You use up all your calcium or you have hypocalcemia going on, then you might have some muscle weakness as well. Or perhaps you used up all your acetylcholine in that neuromuscular junction. If you don't have any of these, you could have that muscle weakness. And let this be a precursor to you, or an omen to you for some of you, a bad omen to you, that one condition, one sign and symptom can't be contributed usually to just one single thing going on. It can only be contributed to you have to rule out a lot of different things, including central fatigue. So if your nervous system just goes out of whack too, then, well, obviously your muscles aren't going to do its thing either. You've gone and exercised, you've worn yourself out, you've gotten too much lactic acid buildup, but you've survived the tiger attack. Well, you need to rebuild up your reserves. So you need to reload some O2 into some myoglobin. You got to get your creatine phosphate built back up. You can reconvert that lactate into pyruvate, which remember at the end of glycolysis, that's what it's made into, and then refeed it back in for cellular respiration to make energy. Now, how sarcomeres aren't really amazing, right? They're itty bitty, teeny tiny little things. You need several sarcomeres to actually make these things work, make your muscles do what you want it to do. As well as you need a signal, a consistent, often signal from your central nervous system saying, hey, we got to maintain this. And it can send it over and 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 over again saying, we got to stay strong. So let's start off with the simple twitch. Let's say that you're laying in bed and all of a sudden, doink, 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 doink. You just feel your toe moving and it's just so absolutely infuriating. Well, that twitch and this twitch are a tiny bit different, but they're a very similar relationship. What happens is if you have sent one tiny electrical signal to that muscle to make it twitch, and only one, you have several cycles or several descriptions to that wave of a twitch. Remember that sodium influxing in causes an increase of force and contraction over a period of time. So sodium rushes in, you still have to wait for that calcium to be released and all that stuff. Signal has to be sent from the neuron has to release acetylcholine has to do that sodium interaction, that sodium has to interact with calcium, and calcium has to interact with troponin, and there you go, magnificent, we finally get it. So you better have a latent period. It's a very small latent period, 5 milliseconds, but you have to have a latent period. After that all takes into account, you finally get the contractions going, myosin's finally interacting with actin. You get that one signal, but that calcium's being reabsorbed back into the reticular sarcoplasmic reticulum. Acetylcholine's not being released anymore, so, well, there's no really reason to, that trypomyosin starts getting in the way again, and that relaxation period finally takes over, and you go back to normal. So that's a nice simple twitch. Now, you can start combining these to finally getting some more action going on. There's something called unfused tetanus and fused tetanus, which unfused tetanus, you're getting multiple. Here's this blue line that's talking about the neuron, that part of that nervous system, that cell from the nervous system, sending signals. When you get multiple signals that are kind of interspersed, you're starting to get that shivering and shaking going on. It doesn't look like a clean, smooth curl that you got going on. That's called unfused tetanus, when you get that trembling curl. Fused tetanus is that nice, smooth contraction. And that's called fused tetanus because the frequency of that action potential coming from that nervous system is so frequent enough that it doesn't have time to try and relax again. It just goes boom until finally the signal goes away. Now, all y'all have muscle tone. I don't care what anyone else says. Everyone's got muscle tone. What muscle tone is saying that when you are standing up, what's holding you up? Your muscles aren't relaxed. Those muscles that are holding you up are toned up. They are getting signals saying, hey, you have got to be working or we're going to fall flat on our face. We're going to fall flat on our butt. It's not going to be very good. It's not going to be very comfortable. Keep that head up. Keep that gut in, all that stuff. You're keeping that muscle tone. Now, muscle tone can be maintained in two different ways. You have the isotonic or an isometric. We could use these words to describe it, but it's just easier to look at a picture. Isometric, let's start off over here. So isometric means that you are maintaining that nice tone. You're keeping that. This gentleman here is holding out this book, and he's holding out and keeping it up. That is called an isometric movement. If you are having movement, with your muscles, that is called isotonic. And there are two forms. You got eccentric and then concentric. The way I remembered it is eccentric. Somebody that is eccentric is really open up and asking you, hey, how's it going? And they're like super excited to be there. Notice that this gentleman has opened up and is wanting to talk to you. If it's concentric, you're noticing that that book is going up to his face. He doesn't want to see you. He needs to concentrate on this book. Concentrated, concentric. This man is concentrated and being concentric. Eccentric, he's opening up. Isometric, no movement. Now that we know how movement goes, we know about metabolism, we know about how sarcomeres work, we can talk about the different types of fibers inside a skeletal muscle. Yeah, we got those pull and peel Twizzlers, but they're not all the same color. Some of them are green, blue, red, all that stuff. Same thing with these muscle fibers here. You got a fast glycolytic fiber, which is a nice white color. You got a beautiful tone of tannish gold, and then a very rich, lovely chocolate color with a slow oxidative fiber. All of which have different roles. And it kind of, their names, well, hint at what they do. Fast glycolytic means fast, it has to happen quick. Fast oxidative, well, oxy refers to oxygen, so that means it probably has a lot of its metabolism coming from oxygen, but also having a little bit of what glycolytic means. So like that lactic acid stuff. And then you got the slow oxidative. This one's probably primarily only oxygen driven, cellular respiration driven. They all have different roles. So the color that's slow oxidative, that dark chocolate rich, or they were saying a dark red here, is that slow oxidative fiber. It has a lot to do with aerobic respiration. It has maintaining your posture or long endurance activities. You got the fast oxidative ones, which, well, that is your aerobic respiration. This is your walking and sprinting, a quick burst of power. And then you got the fast glycolytic, which has to happen very quickly, solely low to only anaerobic glycolysis, very rapid, intense movements. This is usually like shot putting almost. Finally, like I had mentioned, we're going to finish off with cardiac and smooth, and probably I lied. We're going to add in one more about what happens to skeletal muscle and muscle in general as you age. Cardiac muscle, again, you have those intercalated discs. That is like the #1 feature you need to remember. You have the striations here. Remember, those are sarcomeres, but then you have these intercalated discs in between each cell, which are gap junctions, which allow nutrients and things to interchange with one another. It also explains why the heart can contract in a very wave-like fashion rather than all at once like your biceps does. We'll be talking more about that in AMP3. Its cycle, its twitch complex is a little bit different compared to that of the skeletal muscle, but I digress. That's not important for this session right now. Again, it has that intercalated disc. It has that desmosome. It can beat quite a bit. Does a wonderful job at it, and it needs that it needs oxygen, it needs that cellular respiration in order to work. If you cut off oxygen to the heart muscle, then you got uh-ohs. You're not going to last very long. Finally, you got the smooth muscle. Notice that you don't have those striations. They're like little, almost squamous cell look in appearance. They're single units. They have like the sarcomeres. They do have sarcomeres, but it's like super interspersed. That's why you don't see striations. And when the sarcomeres are induced to contract, it kind of causes like little stress balloon thing where you just squish them and the little bubbles come out from your stress ball. That's what it kind of reminds me of. But it does indeed shorten that cell. It's not a super strong shortening, but it does its job. Finally, let's talk as you get older, what happens to make your cells grow and then shrink eventually. Hypertrophy. means these are two phrases right here that you really need to know. Hypertrophy means to enlarge and get bigger. Hyperplasia means to make a lot of different cells. So this is making one cell bigger. This is making a lot more cells. Your muscles do hypertrophy. They do not do hyperplasia. They do hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is what your muscles do. If they get cut, if they get amputated, you actually have to sever quite a bit of the muscle tissue to be able to reimplant it a little bit, especially the crust injury tissue, most likely. Finally, as you start getting older, when you're past your wonder years of 20 to 30, hopefully you have bulked up quite nicely. You have built up your muscles. You have been exercising and striving. Because eventually you start, when you hit 30 to 50, about 10% of your muscle mass is replaced by connective tissue and adipose tissue. Not a happy thought. When you get to 50 and 80, you lose about 40% of your muscle mass is replaced by this stuff. Now, what is the moral of the story of this? If you continually exercise and push yourself and work in a very safe way, you can maintain the strength and integrity of your muscles for a long time, even though, because as you get older, yeah, you lose 10% of it when you're going 30 to 50. But if you're always exercising, you're always curling 50 pounds a day, or you're working towards 60 or 70 or what have you, I can't do that. By the way, that's not important what I can do, but if you continue on, those muscle fibers that are still left behind will compensate and grow stronger. Same thing with the 50 to 80. Maybe you'll start losing the battle a little bit. You'll start losing your ability to curl as much as you can, but you will still be able to function properly as when you get older and enjoy those golden years. They call them golden years only if you're trying to stay healthy and strong. With that, that is the end. I hope this has been helpful. And remember, you got this.